women and children being sold into slavery. It sounds like the actions of the terrorists have no limit. But indeed, even what we've heard is a very, very small piece of the picture. Because despite the threat of suicide bombers, despite the threat of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, of Boko Haram, of terrorist groups that we don't even know the name of yet, the biggest threat is not only continuing, it's expanding, it's growing, and the United States, I think almost any day, along with the other permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, is about to sign an agreement with the Ayatollahs in Tehran over their nuclear weapons program that will be, in my judgment, the biggest single act of appeasement by the West since Munich in September of 1938. This is a catastrophic blunder that we are about to make. For all of the barbarity of the terrorist acts that we've seen and the threats that they pose to Muslims, Christians, Jews, everyone in the Middle East, the spread of nuclear weapons and possibly the spread of chemical and biological weapons as well constitute a scourge that's far more deadly, that really is the existential threat that our current White House can't seem to find anywhere in the world. For all that we suffered on 9/11, imagine the consequences if the next large 9/11 in the United States were carried out by terrorists who possess nuclear weapons. In Israel, they know the risk of rogue states, terrorist states getting nuclear weapons. Now deceased Prime Minister Ariel Sharon warned of the threat of what he called a nuclear holocaust. Israel is a small country. It doesn't take many nuclear weapons, maybe half a dozen. Then there is no Israel. That's why the threat that we see from proliferation should be absorbing our public debate in this country. The threat of the Iranian nuclear weapons program is not Israel's responsibility. It's America's responsibility. Because if we and our friends don't stop Iran, it will fall to Israel to do that. The fact is that nuclear proliferation is a problem global in scope. And we have spent years avoiding that problem. We've got in Asia the threat of a nuclear North Korea. The most heavily sanctioned country in the world has exploded 3 nuclear devices. And just last month, General Scaparrotti, the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, said that he felt that the North Koreans were close enough to being able to miniaturize their warheads that they could place them on the top of Taepodong-2 missiles that were on the verge of having the capability of reaching the west coast of the United States, something the South Korean Ministry of Defense corroborated shortly thereafter. Now, what does that have to do with Iran and Israel? Very simple. Ever since 1998, when North Korea fired a missile that landed in the Pacific east of Tokyo, the governments of North Korea and Iran have cooperated on their ballistic missile development. North Korea at the time, in response to outrage in Japan, went into a moratorium on test launching missiles from the Korean Peninsula. That didn't mean they stopped testing, it meant they worked with Iran. And why not? They both use the same Soviet-era Scud missile technology. The purpose of the missile programs in both countries is exactly the same. It's not to launch weather or communication satellites, it's to launch nuclear warheads. So at least for these past nearly 20 years now, we've seen these two countries collaborate publicly on their ballistic missile development programs. And it's very hard not to imagine that they're cooperating on their nuclear weapons programs as well. When the Israeli Defense Forces destroyed a reactor under construction in Syria in September of 2007, we found that it was being constructed by North Koreans following the design of North Korea's only known nuclear reactor at Yongbyon. Now, what were North Koreans doing in Syria? Was it because of their long, close cultural affinity? They shared the same language, same religion. What were they doing in Syria? We don't know the answer for sure, but I'll tell you this, North Korea doesn't give anything away for free. And I don't think myself Syria had the resources to purchase their services. I think we will find, inevitably, deep Iranian involvement. Because after all, what better place to conduct your illicit nuclear weapons activities than in a country where you think nobody was looking? And in fact, the United States was not looking. Israel was, and Israel found that reactor. Now, I believe that almost inevitably, this cooperation has enabled Iran, whether hidden in mountains somewhere in Iran or hidden in mountains somewhere in North Korea, capabilities that our negotiators and the other five permanent members of the Security Council are simply ignoring. The way you hear the public debate about this agreement that's being negotiated is if we know 100% about what Iran's nuclear capabilities are. This is the farthest thing from the truth. Number one, if the past 25 years have taught us anything, it should be to have a little humility when it comes to our intelligence gathering capabilities. Number two, we know that we don't know everything now. The Iranian government has precluded the International Atomic Energy Agency from conducting inspections about allegations of weaponization that I think we firmly believe are correct. So we don't know where we're starting from, which means we can't verify when Iran has deviated from the agreement we're about to enter. In fact, the whole agreement itself is flawed. We hear leaked from the administration. It's very complex. It's very technical. How many centrifuges for uranium enrichment will Iran be allowed to maintain? What capacity will they be allowed to operate the centrifuges at? What will they have to do with the low-enriched uranium, reactor-grade uranium that's produced? On and on and on. The very complexity of the agreement should tell us that the agreement is flawed. If the idea is to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability, they should be precluded from any uranium enrichment capability, whatever, period, close quote. That's not hard to say. But in fact, the whole nature of the agreement that we're negotiating is simply to try and buy some degree of insurance that when Iran violates it, we will have enough notice that we'll be able to take action. Number one, I don't think there's any guarantee we'll have the advance notice. And number two, at least for the foreseeable future, 2 years, who thinks we'll do anything about it anyway? So the fate of not just the region, but really the entire world is at stake here for at least two reasons. One, when Iran gets nuclear weapons, you can count on Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and maybe others in the region getting nuclear weapons as well. And I cite as my authority for that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who got it right on this occasion. We will see a massive proliferation in the Middle East that will take this already volatile region and make it even more volatile. Number two, we don't have to wait for Iran or North Korea to get a ballistic missile capability that can reach the United States. Iran has been the largest financer of international terrorism since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. It has armed and equipped terrorists, Sunni and Shia alike. Once Iran gets a working nuclear device, or they get one from North Korea, you can put it in a boxcar, put it in a tramp steamer, sail it into any harbor in the world, and detonate it there. A very primitive delivery mechanism, but just as mortal to anybody who happens to be within range. So that the threat that Iran poses is not simply to its region, it is a threat worldwide. And we are engaged in a course of action that will simply legitimize Iran's uranium enrichment capability. What every expert will tell you is the long pole in the tent in a nuclear weapons program, and enable them to continue building a very broad and deep nuclear infrastructure. Now, our administration says in a listless fashion that all options are on the table when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons program, by which they mean the implicit possibility that we will use force to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Nobody believes this threat. Nobody believes it. The Iranians don't believe it. Israel doesn't believe it. I don't even think the president believes it when he says it. So what that means is now we are down to two options. Option one, Iran gets nuclear weapons. I think that is far and away the most likely outcome, and everything that flows from that. Option two is that Israel decides, as it has twice before in its history, to take matters into its own hands and destroy a nuclear weapons program in the hands of a hostile state. I don't know what Israel is going to do. It's a terribly hard decision to make because of the risks that are inevitably entailed to Israel and its innocent civilian population. But I just want everybody here to be prepared for the possibility that we will wake up one morning and find that Israel has acted, and to be ready to argue as soon as we hear about it that if Israel does decide to use military force, it will be a legitimate exercise of Israel's inherent right to self-defense. And second, that it is at that point the responsibility of the United States to resupply Israel immediately for the planes and ordnance and other military equipment that will inevitably be lost in this attack on our behalf against Iran's nuclear weapons program, because Iran's most likely retaliation will be to unleash Hezbollah and Hamas to attack Israel and its civilian population. So Israel needs immediate air superiority over the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and it needs to finish the job once and for all in the Gaza Strip. This is going to be very, very difficult. What I've outlined to you is not pleasant, but beheading people for their religion or their ethnicity is not pleasant either. Selling women and children into slavery is not pleasant. This is the face of terrorism. The worst face is the nuclear face, and that is where we are at this point, I think, most incapable of protecting ourselves. We have within our powers, American citizens, the right and the ability to elect our leaders in Washington. We have to say that when it comes to American national security, we're in a very perilous place right now. But we can fix that. That is the promise of our constitutional democracy in this country. It's why the actions that all of you take in worrying about anti-Semitism, worrying about threats to religious liberty and free speech in the United States and around the world are so important. Because it's very clear, if we don't defend our friends and if we don't defend our values and our interests, nobody else is going to do it. It all rests on us. Thank you very much.